Do you ever find yourself asking God where He's been? Ever get up out of bed saying, I can't do this again? Have you ever been afraid of what tomorrow's gonna bring? And you're facing it alone, at least that's what you think. I can tell you after going through that valley, even though I didn't see it at the time, it was in my weakest moments that He held me, and I know you'll find He will carry you when you can't go on. He will be your strength when your strength is gone. He will lift you up. He will be enough to get you through. When the road is long and you want to quit, 'cause you think you've got nothing left to give, you can fall apart, fall into His arms. He will carry you. When you get the kind of news that you hope you never hear, when you're chasing down a dream just to watch it disappear, when somebody that you love turns and walks away, and they leave you standing there with a shattered faith. You don't have to pick up all the broken pieces. You don't have to try to cover up the scars. You are loved and you can always run to Jesus, just as you are. He will carry you when you can't go on. He will be your strength when your strength is gone. He will lift you up. He will be enough to get you through. When the road is long and you want to quit, 'cause you think you've got nothing left to give, you can fall apart, fall into His arms. He will carry you. His heart is never weary. No, He's never tired. Through the toughest fight, through the longest night, through the mud and through the fire, He will carry you when you can't go on. He'll be your strength when your strength is gone. He will lift you up. He will be enough to get you through. When the road is long and you want to quit, 'cause you think you've got nothing left to give, you can fall apart, fall into His arms. He will carry you. He will carry you.
That's the Swore Family with Sailor Lucas joining them on that one. That's He'll Carry You, a beautiful song, another song that has lyrics related to encouraging God's people during their times of depression. A song that I believe the lyrics were inspired by that infamous poem entitled Footprints. If you take a look at the lyrics, I believe Brian Free and Assurance, Southern Gospel Group, made that song popular. And I do not know if they were inspired by Footprints, but looking at the lyrics, it appears to be based loosely on that. And a beautiful poem, beautiful message, Bible truth. Amen. Well, good evening and welcome to another King James Bible study. I'm Dr. Joseph Speciale, and this is a special edition of our King James Bible study. as we're bringing you a special series of lessons on the subject of depression. We call it the Bible Truth on Depression, and today we're on part number 3. In lesson number 1, we gave you an introduction to the subject and gave you an idea of where we're going in the course of this study, and began by defining the term depression. In lesson number 2, for the most part, we spent our time presenting some common myths related to the subject of depression and debunking those 4 main myths. Moving forward here in the next lesson or so, we're going to be taking a look now at the sufferers, the symptoms, the sources, and the solutions for depression, primarily from a clinical standpoint. And if you recall from our previous lessons, I'll mention 2 things about the clinical information that we're sharing with you. Number 1 is that in my presenting it to you, we're basing it off of clinical sources. This is not my opinion. I am not attempting to be a clinician by any stretch. We don't dare step over those bounds, no more so than we would want a psychotherapist or psychiatrist to step over their bounds and try to tell somebody suffering from depression what they need to do biblically. Okay, if they're not even a Christian, okay, they shouldn't be doing that. Okay, I'm not a trained, licensed, degreed, experienced clinician, so I am not going to give you any clinical opinions. I'm presenting clinical information that is readily available to the public from very reputable, notable sources, most of which is along the lines of Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, UPMC, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and so on, things like that. And the reason why we're presenting you with the clinical information, as we said, point number 2 on that, is to lay a foundation on the sufferers, the symptoms, the sources, and the solutions, okay? To lay a foundation, because the bulk of this series of lessons is going to be spent going through the Bible, looking at examples of men and women who have suffered from depression. And as we take a look at each of those examples, we'll be charting out their symptoms, the source of or sources of their depression, as well as the solutions that were employed. And we're going to see that the Bible confirms most of what is already established by clinical by the clinical community. Now, the Bible will have more to say. I should say, will have additional things to point out for us. And we know that even if the Bible speaks on the subject of depression, or any subject that is not deemed a spiritual topic, the Bible is still right. It's infallible, and it's sufficient. Okay? It's not that the Bible is an exhaustive textbook on the subject of depression, but everything that it speaks of regarding the subject of depression, as well as any other subject, including mathematics, botany, and so on. Whatever it says, we know it's right because the Bible was given by inspiration of God. He's the creator. He's omniscient. He knows everything. Okay? All right, so that's where we're headed here in this part of the lesson, and probably the next 2 lessons thereafter. We'll see how it goes. Again, we're going as the Lord leads. So where are we going to begin tonight? We're going to begin basically from the clinical standpoint now, looking at the sufferers and the symptoms to begin with. I want to present this graphic to you, which is another example of a good summary of the things that we're going to be addressing. I can't recall where this was taken, who put this together. It is a clinical source. It is available on the internet. So I'm sure that if you went to Google or another type of search engine and typed in this type of information regarding clinical depression, what is clinical depression, types of depression, symptoms, and so on, and looked under the images option, you'll find this chart eventually there. Okay. So I want to go over it because I realize not everybody is watching the video form of this lesson, so we want to point out what we're looking at. And this particular slide, again, just gives a summation, an overview of the different things that we intend to talk about. So we mentioned in lesson number 2 the 3 main types of depression in general, namely normal depression, persistent depression, and major depression. And major depression disorder, or MDD, is what we are going to be referring to, and as the clinical community refers to it as, clinical depression. Okay. Now, we alluded to in that lesson as well that there's a number of different subset forms of depression, and this particular slide gives some examples of those. As you see, if you can read that, we have not only major depression and persistent depressive disorder, which are 2 of the forms of depression we covered in lesson 2. They are the 2 that require medical treatment. Okay. But then this slide also indicates bipolar disorder, seasonal affective disorder, or what's called SAD, psychotic depression, peripartum or postpartum depression, premenstrual and dysphonic disorder, PMDD, situational depression, and atypical depression. We're not going to cover any of those. We're sticking with major depression or clinical depression. It gives a definition of depression. It states that it's a serious and common medical psychological condition. Again, we want to emphasize what we hopefully made very clear in the first 2 parts of this series is that depression is not an illness that's in your head, in your mind. Okay? It can be, but it's not just that at any given time. Okay? It is a medical condition. It is a physiological condition. Okay? So depression is a serious and common medical, psychological condition that affects how you think, how you feel, how you act. It interferes with your abilities, making it difficult to perform everyday tasks. I know some of this information is repetitive to what we've already covered, but this information that is being repeated and will continue to be repeated through the course of this series is worthy of memorizing, of being able to recall, to know with a degree of understanding. So it's worthy of repetition. Symptoms of clinical depression, and we've seen some of that already. Here's another list of examples: depressed mood, irritable mood, loss of interest, changes in appetite or eating habits, changes in sleep patterns, anxiety. We've talked about the interrelationship, the reciprocal relationship between anxiety and depression. That anxiety can cause depression, depression can cause anxiety. Restlessness and agitation, slowed speech, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, difficulty thinking, thoughts about death, and unexplained physical symptoms. Then we have sources of clinical depression. Note these now. Okay? You're not going to see on this list a Christian who's backslidden. Although being backslidden, having unconfessed sin in your life, can result in depression, no doubt. We'll talk about that. Okay? But for those, getting back to one of the myths that we covered last time, for the Christian community to believe that if a professing Christian is suffering from depression, that means they're either not truly saved or they're backslidden, is a foolish assumption to make. And absolutely incorrect. You can't make that assumption. You don't know. Sources of clinical depression. brain's physical structure, biochemistry, hormones, genetics, environmental factors, personality traits, medical conditions, side effects of medicines, absolutely, and other psychological disorders. See, this particular slide, of course, not written from a Christian perspective, so unfortunately, as is the case with the majority of the clinical community, you're not going to see the spiritual side of depression addressed sufficiently at all, okay? But the purpose of our covering this clinical information is to highlight the clinical piece, okay? And we'll add in the spiritual side as we go along. Solutions for clinical depression. Of course, again, they're not going to list any spiritual solutions here. But that's because this is exclusively from a clinical perspective. It includes medicinal treatment, primarily antidepressants, psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavior therapy. So basically medication and psychotherapy, the two main courses of treatment for clinical depression. No surprise there. So a great slide based on all of the research I did on the clinical side of depression. This, as well as the slide we presented to you in lesson 1, it gave a summation and an overview. Really good information, okay? All right, so what's up next? Let's take a look at the sufferers. The sufferers of depression. We have another graphic, another slide up there for you to look at that presents a really good summary of the demographics related to depression, the demographics and statistics associated with those demographics. And the first thing we want to point out is something that I think we mentioned in one of the two previous lessons, is that according to the World Health Organization, and that's where most of these statistics are coming from, the World Health Organization characterizes depression as the leading cause of disability worldwide. It affects 350 million people every year, or 4.375% of the world's population based on a population of 8 billion. That's a lot. That's a lot. The next statistic, roughly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men will suffer depression at some point in their lifetime. That's pretty crazy. 1 in 5 women, that's 20%. 1 in 10 men, that's 10%, will suffer depression at some point in their lifetime. Major depression is also the leading cause of disability in the United States of America. We mentioned in a previous lesson that the statistic there is over 19 million adults, or about 10% of the adult population, meaning those 18 and older, suffer from depression each year. Over 19 million adults. Now the statistics get even more alarming for the United States. The rate of depression for adults between the ages of 18 and 25, so we're talking about young adults now, college and career people, young ones, okay? The rate of depression for that age bracket, 18 to 25, is nearly double of those 26 and older. What's happening to our young people? It doesn't get any better the younger you go. When we go down to the ages of 12 to 17, so we're talking adolescents and teens, an estimated 3.1 million children between those ages of 12 and 17 have experienced at least one depressive episode in the past year. Now, I'm going to give you my opinion, okay? It's not a clinical opinion. It's just a personal opinion based on the information, the statistics that I've just shared with you. And that personal opinion or observation is this. I personally believe that those crazy, alarming numbers related to young adults and our children that exhibit a skyrocketing in the rate of depression, basically from 12 to 25, I believe is primarily, I won't say exclusively, but primarily due to the COVID lockdowns in 2020 and 2021. You can't convince me that shutting our kids out from any type of social contact with their peers in elementary school, junior high, middle school, or high school, or even some of them college, that it didn't have a negative impact on them psychologically. It most absolutely did. It absolutely did. And we're going to be paying for that for years to come. Another statistic. Women are affected by depression almost twice as often as men. In that an estimated 5% to 12% of men will become clinically depressed at some point in their lives, while an estimated 10% to 25% of women will become clinically depressed. Remember, we said just a moment ago that from the World Health Organization, globally now, roughly 1 in 5 women, or 20%, are going to suffer depression at some point in their lives. Well, the range is between 10 and 25%. That's crazy. Very high. Very high. And that applies to the United States as well. For the United States, the median age of onset for depression is 32 and a half years old. From a biblical standpoint, that ought to ring a bell for us, because 33 and a half is the prime of life, isn't it? That's the age that Jesus was when he died on the cross and rose again. Prime of life, 33 and a half. Well, 32 and a half is the median age for the onset of depression in the United States. I suspect that that age number is going to come down dramatically over the next year to 5 years, and it's going to stay down there for a while. Another demographic is disabled people. A statistic for them regarding depression is that disabled people are 5 times more likely to suffer from depression than those who are able-bodied. And that should not surprise any of us. It is alarming. 5 times, not 5% more, 5 times more. So to put it in perspective, for every 1 able-bodied person that suffers depression, you have 5 disabled people. Wow. The depression rate within the LGBTQ community, even worse. It's estimated that 1 in every 2, 50% of those in the LGBTQ community suffer from depression. And I'm just going to make a personal, spiritual-based comment at this point on that. We are not doing these people any favors by reinforcing and celebrating their sin. We're not doing them any favors whatsoever. We might be letting others know how woke we are and doing our best to avoid cancellation and ostracization from the establishment, but we're not doing the people who are actually suffering any favors whatsoever. You and I, who are Christians, know full well that every single letter in that LGBTQ plus alphabet there represents sexual perversion, a sin against the Lord, an abomination. And sin has consequences. The Bible says, be sure your sin will find you out. And so for us to encourage them in their delusion, to encourage them in their sin, is to bring upon them swift destruction. And it's because this is a sin, I believe, that the rate of depression is so much worse for them. It's not the only reason. Okay, I would not be foolish to make such an assumption. But knowing what I know from the Bible, there is no doubt that the increased rate of depression within that community is due, I'll say even largely in part, to the fact that they're engaged in open sin against the Lord. You can't do that and be healthy. You just can't. And so it highlights the need to reach this community with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, as well as helping them get the clinical help they need. Now, unfortunately, and I'll say this as well, since most, not all, most clinicians they won't touch the spiritual side of things here when it comes to depression. They won't touch it. If for any reason I would think they'd be afraid of being caught and losing any license to practice, as so many who went against the mainstream message of COVID during the pandemic did when they stood up and spoke out against some of the things that were being practiced, the protocols that were being forced on the medical community to implement. There were very esteemed doctors who lost their license. And I believe the same pressure would be brought to bear upon the psychiatric community, the psychotherapists, and so forth, if any of them attempted to try to help members of the LGBTQ community from a spiritual perspective, even just bringing it up. Again, not necessarily going in a place biblically where they're not trained to go, but at least identifying that there is a spiritual component at work here and referring them to a spiritual source, an expert, a pastor of some sort that could counsel them and help them with the spiritual side. Okay? And there are some pastors who are degreed psychotherapists as well, who can be a one-stop shop, if you will. Okay? Unfortunately, again, most clinicians won't go there. And so a truth, a fact that we are going to be highlighting numerous times is that if this condition is not seen for being something that affects the entire person, body, soul, and spirit, then you can't see that it requires solutions from all three perspectives. And to not do that then means that the patient is not going to receive all of the treatment that they might need. And so their recovery, their healing will either not occur at all, and likely will not occur at all completely, or it will be prolonged. Okay? And with the LGBTQ community, man, it's a disaster waiting to happen, because the suicide rate in that community is also through the roof. Through the roof. And folks, they end up taking their lives, there's not a thing we can do for them at that point, right? If they die lost and die without Jesus, I mean, there's nothing worse than that. So, to say the least, there's a desperate need in the clinical community for clinicians who will recognize that there's a spiritual component here, and to either get the training themselves from a biblical standpoint, and we know that there's a good number of born-again Christians who are psychotherapists, okay, or work in tandem with a pastor who has some degree. And when I say degree, I'm talking about level, not necessarily a formal degree, a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in psychology or psychiatry, but a pastor who has some sort of certification for this type of counseling as well, so they can speak your language with you. So when you refer the patient, and you give a degree of information, you may not be able to divulge all of the clinical information just due to patient and physician confidentiality, but to give the pastor, the pastoral counselor, enough information to work with so that they can treat them spiritually. We need more of that, especially for that community right there. Speaking of pastors, they're not exempt from depression either. No, no, no. A Barna Group study revealed that 45% of pastors, 45%, have experienced depression or burnout to the extent that they needed to take a leave of absence from the ministry. Now that's pretty serious. 45% didn't just experience depression, but 45% said that the depression or burnout, was so bad that they had to take a leave of absence from the ministry. Some even quit altogether. 45%. What do these statistics tell us? The sufferers of depression include everyone. Depression can come to anyone at any time. Not just from a clinical standpoint, but we will see this truth backed up biblically when we look at the examples of those who've suffered depression in the Bible. That depression can come to anyone at any time. Depression can come in the immediate aftermath of your most greatest personal triumphs. But it can also come in the aftermath of personal tragedy. And see, it's the former that is more shocking. We totally understand how depression can come in the immediate aftermath of personal tragedy, but it can also come in the aftermath of our greatest personal triumph. It is no respecter of persons and no respecter of circumstances at all. Okay? Depression can affect anyone, and it comes at a great cost too. The estimated cost to treat depression in the United States, over $30 billion each year. 2/3 of those who are depressed never seek treatment. And so they're suffering unnecessarily. 2/3. So we mentioned to you that over 19 million adults, 3.1 million children ages 12 to 17. So if we apply that statistic, 2/3 won't even seek help whatsoever. Another statistic, 80% to 90% of those who do seek treatment feel better within just a few weeks. So mind you, we're not even talking about those who might receive some degree of pastoral and biblical counseling. These are folks who are getting help from clinicians, psychotherapy, medications, or a combination thereof. 80 to 90% of those who do go to seek treatment, and only 1/3 do, but of the third that do, 80 to 90% report feeling better within just a few weeks. And so that 2/3 that's not seeking any treatment, they are truly suffering needlessly. One of the most alarming statistics regarding the sufferers of depression is this one. About 2/3 of the people with clinical depression, and again, 2/3 who have depression don't seek treatment. Well, about 2/3 of the people with clinical depression think about suicide. 2/3. And 10 to 15% of those people actually carry it out. So 2/3 think about suicide. That's one of the symptoms we'll be talking about. Thoughts of death and suicide. Definitely a symptom of clinical depression. But of those who have such thoughts, a staggering 10 to 15% actually do it. Now, I didn't say 10 to 15% attempt it. I said 10 to 15% actually do it, are successful at killing themselves. Wow. Does not have to be. Very tragic. All right, so that's your sufferers. And to those facts, we will have very little to add to it from a biblical perspective later. We will just basically start looking at some specific examples of those who suffered depression in the Bible. Okay, but the statistics are what the statistics are. And the world we're living in, those statistics are only going to get worse. Truly, they're only going to get worse. So let's take a look briefly here now at the symptoms. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because the symptoms are something that we're going to keep bringing up and showing you all throughout this series of lessons. And depending on the source that you look at, depending on the clinical source, I mean, we have 11 of them up on the screen right now. Well, it doesn't mean there's just 11. There's boatloads of symptoms for clinical depression. Okay? Some are more prevalent than others. Okay? As we pointed out, I believe in lesson 1, or maybe it was lesson 2 when we made the distinction between major depression and persistent depression, because there's two very specific symptoms of depression that a patient must have before he can be diagnosed with major depression. And again, those are low mood and loss of interest in things that they previously enjoyed. So that low mood is going to be, extreme sadness, okay? No motivation, and then if the loss of interest in things they previously enjoyed doing. Those two symptoms must be present in the patient for them to be diagnosed with major depression. Okay? So outside of that, you're pretty much going to get a number of different lists of symptoms. The one we have before you is the most comprehensive that I was able to see. So let's go ahead and run through these in the order they appear on the screen, realizing that the symptoms of clinical depression, each one of these, can range from mild to severe. But in clinical depression, they're going to last most, if not all, the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks. Okay? And they are, first of all, withdrawal and isolation. Withdrawal and isolation. The patient is not going to want to be around people. They're not going to want to be in crowds and gatherings. They're not going to want to go out in public. They're going to go in their room or a room and hunker down and not have anything, not want to have anything to do with anyone. And so if you're talking about somebody who is otherwise extroverted, somebody who is gregarious, this would be a immediate red flag. Those who are more introverted, who are loners, as we call them, may not be as noticeable. Okay? But there's always, I consider myself, believe it or not, an introverted individual. I am. And the older I get, the more introverted I become. But I think I'm pretty representative of most introverts in that there's still situations in which I enjoy being in crowds and socializing with people. For example, I like being in church. Of course, enjoy the church service. I'm not one that gets all giddy and excited about social gatherings and all of that. But when I'm in them, when I'm actually already in them, I do fine. And of course, I love spending time with my family when they come over. We don't have to engage in hour-long conversation. I enjoy just being in the same room with my wife, with my sons and daughters-in-law, and my grandchildren. So no, may not be as gregarious as others and striking up conversation, but I enjoy still being in their company. So I'm introverted, but I still enjoy that. Somebody who's suffering from clinical depression doesn't want to be in any of those situations whatsoever. They want to be alone. They need to be alone. And that isolation is the last thing they need. Symptom number 2 is extreme fatigue or lack of energy. Extreme fatigue, lack of energy, low energy, whatever you want to call it. So this is what in their mind, this is going to be something that they feel physically. They're not going to feel like they can do anything even if they wanted to. They're not going to have the motivation, but even if they did, they don't feel they can do it. Number 3, trouble focusing and functioning. Again, this is one of the distinctions between clinical depression and just normal depression that we all experience. I mean, when you or I are feeling depressed, low mood, or whatever, even if that depressive mood captures us for a prolonged period of time, let's say a number of days, we're still able within each of those days to do a degree or a great degree of our daily functioning. We are also able to at least focus somewhat, if not completely. But those who suffer from clinical depression, it is an absolute struggle to concentrate and to focus on any one thing. And as far as their daily functionality is concerned, they're hindered. They're absolutely hindered. They or just completely broken down and can't do it at all. So absolutely a flag. Number 4, outbursts of tears or anger. So here you have the extremity of moodiness, and with no apparent trigger whatsoever. From going from just stoic to complete breakdown of tears, or from a stoic state to just this rabid outburst of anger. Okay? With no apparent triggers. That's a flag as well. Alcohol abuse and drug abuse. So any type of substance abuse here is also a flag. Of course, alcohol and drug abuse doesn't need to be caused by depression. Alcohol and drug abuse is just done because somebody doesn't have a lick of sense. Okay? But it is absolutely a byproduct of depression. The person turns to the bottle, turns to the pill, turns to the needle to get what they believe is relief. Some, maybe even many people who abuse these substances are doing it with the sincere intention of helping their depression, not realizing that it's the worst thing they could be doing. Alcohol and drug abuse, definitely a symptom of depression. Not exclusively to depression, but still a symptom of it. Number 6, intense despair and hopelessness. We've all been in situations where things appear hopeless, where we feel like we're despairing. This is where Christians have a huge leg up on lost people, because we know that the Bible truth is emphatically clear that we are never, as God's children, without hope. Ever. And to that end, we never need to despair. It's a waste of time. Okay? Lost people don't have that. But nevertheless, when people suffer from depression, even Christians, there can be the symptom of intense despair and hopelessness. It can be there. So I say all that to say, if a person who's truly saved is feeling this way, it's a good indication they have clinical depression. And then we have some behavioral changes in symptoms number 7 and 8. Change in appetite, change in sleep patterns. And we say changes because it could be eating too much or not eating at all. It could be sleeping too much, hypersomnia, or not sleeping at all, or difficulty sleeping at all, insomnia. But either way, how important nutrition is to our mental health, probably every bit as important as it is to our physical health. And so to not eat at all is a dangerous thing. And I think we can all attest to the fact that if we're sleep deprived, not getting proper sleep, we all naturally become far more irritable, don't we? We can't focus. Okay? All of that. So a person with clinical depression, that's in hyperdrive. They can't sleep, or they're sleeping all the time. Changes in sleep patterns. Then symptom number 9, thoughts of death and suicide. Thoughts of death and suicide. This should never be trivialized. If anybody who's exhibiting any of these other symptoms mentions the idea of taking their own life, you take it seriously. Now, and act. I say if they exhibit any other symptom, because if there's no other symptom present, then of course take it all in context, but always take it seriously. But the person who says something like that could in context be just exaggerating or saying it in jest, whatever the case may be. But such words are always to be taken seriously. Okay? Feelings of guilt or feelings of worthlessness. And that really can tie right into the previous symptom of thoughts of death and suicide. Because once a person gets to a point where they feel they have no worth, the very next step is usually to consider taking their own life. Feelings of guilt, can't forgive themselves, and a sense of worthlessness. And then something we've referred to a number of times already, the loss of interest in things that brought joy. So maybe it's a habit, not a habit, a hobby. A hobby, thank you. A hobby, a craft, some sort of other interest that the person has that's been a big part of their life and they thoroughly enjoy it, and now they have no interest in it whatsoever. It could even be their pets. Some people have great joy in their dogs, their cats, whatever they have as a pet. And in times where they're feeling normally down, a normal sense of low mood or depression, they find great consolation and comfort, with their lapdog or their cat or whatever. And now, no interest whatsoever. No interest. Some people like to get out into nature. Some like to go fishing, go hunting. Some like to work out. And they don't just do this because they know it helps them to be distracted and work this thing out, but they do it because they truly enjoy that physical workout, that hunting and that fishing and so on. But now have no interest whatsoever. So when it's suggested, why don't you go out to the lake and fish? Why don't you go to the gym and work out? No desire. No motivation, no desire. So there's 11 symptoms right there. Again, we could name many, many more depending on the source you have, but that's a good sample right there. And I think that would probably be, if you looked at 10 separate lists from 10 separate sources, I would say the vast majority of those 11 will appear on every list. Yep. Now, what's going to happen, as far as I can tell from my research, is that when a person is exhibiting these symptoms, it's not that they're going to be immediately diagnosed with clinical depression. Medical providers, doctors, physicians, may order various diagnostic tests to rule out other medical conditions that could be the source of these symptoms. So they'll do that either before or concurrent to any other activities. They may very well begin the referral process for their patient to get them to a psychotherapist in the event that this truly is clinical depression. Or they will wait completely until they've run all of the diagnostics first to make sure something else isn't causing it. Okay, and that's usually what's going to happen. All the other diagnostic tests are done first to rule out any other source of the problem. Okay? All right, so time check. Time check. I think we're going to go ahead and we are going to stop there. It's a little bit shorter lesson than our previous two, but we're going to go ahead and stop there because the next lesson for part number 4, we're going to start getting into the sources of depression, and those are also aplenty, okay? Depending on the source you consult there, there's a number of different reasons. Now, I'll say this in wrapping up here, is that the clinical community used to believe that there was a primary source for depression. And based on that assumption, based on that conclusion, the appropriate treatment was prescribed. Currently, the clinical community is well aware that that was an incorrect assumption and that the sources of depression are manifold, making this a far more complex issue than what anybody ever originally thought. And so I will just submit to you, in my humble opinion, again, not a clinical one, but just a personal opinion based on all the facts that have already been shared with you and what I know about the Bible, is that the sources, since depression affects us physically, our body, it affects us mentally and emotionally, our soul, and it affects us spiritually, the sources are going to be from the two aspects of physical and spiritual. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll dive into those in part number 4. Okay? Well, we sincerely hope that this lesson has been a blessing and a help to you. If nothing else, has enlightened you and equipped you with information and knowledge moving forward. And so we hope you'll be able to join us for part number 4. We'll get that up in another week. And we'll just keep going with these until we're done. All right? So until next time, the Lord bless you, and you have a good day.